two young boys take turns swinging an axe to fulfill their sacred task, an assigned vocation to cut down the gigas cedar, hindering their village's growth. But it's futile, barely making a dent, like the 6 generations that preceded them. The helplessness quickly fades as Alice, their friend, shows up with lunch, greeting both Yuio, the blonde, and a strangely familiar dark-haired boy named Kirito. Their lunch will spoil if they aren't fast enough. If only there was a way to preserve food. Kirito has a brain blast, coming up with an ingenious way to preserve Alice's pie by making it cold, and probably uncomfortably moist using his knowledge of cold salted meat. They just need some ice, which should be no problem in a feudal kingdom lacking the technology to cut down a single tree. They remember a legendary hero who found himself in an ice cave while chasing the dragon guarding the border to the Dark Territories. As long as they don't cross the border, they can avoid breaking the rules detailed in the Taboo Index. Upon reaching the cave, they find enough ice to last the village a lifetime. But something's off. They find the blue rose sword and bones of the ice dragon surrounding a hoard of treasure. There was nothing in the legend about the dragon's death. After gathering as much ice as they can carry, they realize there are multiple paths. Having forgotten which one they came in through, they choose one. That leads to the Dark Territory. They hear the sound of battle and spot an Integrity Knight fighting a knight from the Dark Territory while riding dragons. The Integrity Knight cuts down the Dark Territory Knight, and he drops out of the sky, landing a few meters from the children, reaching out as if asking for help. Alice feels she should and begins to move toward him before the two boys can stop her. She trips, and her finger barely crosses the boundary. Suddenly, a head appears, confirming their fear. Alice has broken the Taboo Index. The Integrity Knight from the day before visits the village, but this time, the only thing he'll be vanquishing is a child. Kirito tries to create a distraction, but Yuio is unable to move. A searing pain in his right eye stops him in his tracks. Shortly after, Kirigaya Kazuto wakes up from a full dive. He meets up with Shino at a cafe, where she asks him to help her in the next BOB before Asuna arrives. Worried about his physical condition, Asuna checks an app that monitors his vitals, figuring his new part-time job was to blame. Shino inquires, and Kazuto explains that he's been working for a company called Wrath that's developing a new type of full dive tech. They call it a soul translator, which uses fluct lights, basically the equivalent of a soul instead of the user's brain, effectively coding short-term memories onto the fluct light to create a more realistic sensory experience. Due to the nature of the project, Kazuto doesn't retain any memories from the virtual world codenamed Underworld. While walking home with Asuna, Kazuto floats the idea of going to America to research the next generation of full dive tech. Only if she would join him, of course. The Soul Transfer project feels like an extension of Kayaba's work, and he would rather distance himself from similar endeavors. They're interrupted by a man who begins to ask for directions, when Kazuto confronts him about following them ever since they left the cafe. Dropping the act, the man reveals that he's a former member of Laughing Coffin and lunges toward Kazuto with a syringe, the same one that Death Gun used on his victims. It's showtime. Kazuto pushes Asuna to safety and tries to fend off their assailant. In the melee, he's injected with the toxin as his umbrella pierces the attacker's leg. But it's too late. Kazuto collapses from cardiac arrest. Kirito wakes up in the middle of a forest with no recollection of how he got there. Judging by the scenery and his clothing, he figures he must be back at the Underworld. But he shouldn't have any memory of the real world if that's the case. He stumbles across Yuio, though he has no memory of him and can't tell if he's an NPC or not. He doesn't recognize any terms relating to video games, so gaining information isn't fruitful. He decides to wait until Yuio finishes his sacred task for the day. He discovers that the game menu is still accessible. Yuio details the incident with Alice, though in his telling, Kirito wasn't there. After explaining his calling, Yuio is surprised when Kirito asks to help. Despite his sword skills and experience, the tree is just as resilient as always. Upon completion of Yuio's daily duty, they head to the village. The boy guarding the gate stops them. he begins to make fun of Yujio's calling and assumes Kirito can't remember his, as a lost child of Vecta, though he's quickly put in his place after Kirito claims to be a swordsman, using his sword to slice through a tree stump. Yujio brings Kirito to the church, where he meets Selka. While falling asleep, he deduces Wrath must have taken the fluctlights of babies. With the in-game acceleration of time, generations of artificial reproduction would culminate in realistic people, especially since Yujio claims it's been 6 years since Alice disappeared, which only happened yesterday, IRL time. The next day, the two boys head to the Gigas tree. Kirito wonders about Selka, who, as it turns out, is Alice's younger sister. After Alice was taken, she took over at the church, learning the sacred arts, system commands perceived as magic. Since the axe is practically useless, Kirito asks if there's anything more powerful. A little while later, Yujio returns with the blue rose sword he retrieved 3 years after the incident. Kirito tries to use it on the tree, but isn't able to do much, but it still beats the axe. If they can raise their object control authority, they should be able to handle the sword properly. That night, Kirito asks Selka about her sister's disappearance. Apparently, Yujio hasn't been the same since. Before leaving, Selka asks why her sister was taken, since no one will tell her. When he wakes up, Selka is nowhere to be found. Yujio immediately deduces she must have gone to the cave where Alice broke the Taboo index. The two hurry after her. They hear screams from inside the cave and discover she's been abducted by goblins. Yujio freezes up, unable to move as the goblins close in. Kirito calms him down and devises a plan to rescue Selka. Arming them with swords, he begins cutting the goblins down. While Yujio watches Kirito fight the goblin leader, he still hesitates to act. Just when it looks like Kirito is about to lose, he finally jumps into action. He distracts the leader long enough for Kirito to recover, though he receives a grievous injury. Kirito enters into a rage and takes out the goblin leader, scaring off the rest. He unties Selka, but when she sees Yujio's state, she isn't sure if her sacred arts can save him. Instead, Kirito decides to transfer his own life energy to save Yujio. Almost passing out, he hears a voice telling him to come save her, and Kirito gets a strange feeling that they've met before. He asks Yujio about it the next day. After the battle, Kirito's skills are high enough to swing the blue rose sword. Yujio wants nothing more than to save Alice and asks him to train him. After some time, their sword skills are high enough to fall the tree as Yujio lands the final blow. Since Yujio has successfully completed his calling, he gets the chance to choose a new one. He vows to become a swordsman like Kirito and travel to the capital to save Alice. After saying goodbye to Selka, the two leave town for the first time in their lives. In the real world, following the attack on Kazuto's life, Asuna and his family are told that he may have permanent brain damage and is in a coma. Kikuoka proposes that the only way they could treat him is in a special facility, though his sister and Asuna are unable to locate him afterwards. They discuss the situation with all their friends and conclude that they must be using the new soul translator tech. Tracking his heart monitor, Asuna gets a ride from Klein to the last location, but it's a dead end. There's a helipad, and now that he's out of range, he could be anywhere. Their best bet is looking into Wrath. Apparently, Rinko Kojiro, Kayaba's assistant, helped develop the technology and might know where Wrath is holding Kazuto. After receiving an email, she decides it's time to pay a visit to their secret base in the middle of the ocean, bringing her assistant with her. Kikuoka is surprised to see her, as Rinko has been ignoring him up until now, but he's glad she came. Apparently, she's one of 3 people required to pull the project off. Having met the second, Takeru, the lead developer, Kikuoka says the 3rd member isn't available at the moment. Asuna then reveals her identity, removing her disguise as Rinko's assistant, and demands to see Kazuto. Since none of the other victims survived the toxic injections, Kikuoka assures her that using the STL is the only way to treat Kazuto's brain damage. They already know that the soul transfer tech can contain souls in what they call fluctlights. But to what end? Well, the real goal of the project is to create a bottom-up AI. Copying adults always leads to instability and collapse. They used the souls of babies so the AI would grow up and learn. Using the seed, they created the Underworld to simulate an entire civilization using the newborn Fluctlights as archetypes, raised by 4 Wrath employees. After they accelerated time in the simulation, society began to form, followed by a governing body who created the Taboo Index, which is followed religiously by the populace, so much so that they are incapable of going against it. That's when they introduced Kirito to the world. Having him grow up with artificial Fluctlights caused one, Alice, to break the Taboo Index. They needed someone with years of experience living in VR worlds, so naturally they decided to use Kirito to investigate how these laws came about and why it's nearly impossible for the artificial Fluctlights to break them. Kirito and Yuio spend the next 2 years in the Underworld honing their sword skills. They successfully enroll in the Sword Mastery Academy, an integral part of becoming an Integrity Knight. Once they achieve that status, it allows them entry into the Central Cathedral and a chance to save Alice. In the Underworld, there are only 3 stats: Life, Object Control Authority, and System Control Authority. They work like in most other games. But there's a twist. The strength of one's mental image and the confidence in their abilities grants power beyond mere numbers. A few days later, Kirito spars with his mentor, Lina. She calls him out on holding back the true potential of his sword style. She chose to train him because she also uses an unconventional style. Over the past few years, her confidence in herself has grown. As the second sword seed, she's never been able to beat the first sword seed, Levantaine, but she may have what it takes, now that she doesn't regard her own style as inferior. He promises to show her the true nature of his sword style as a graduation present the next day. Yuio and Kirito visit an artisan they contracted to craft a sword cut from the tip of the Gigaseater's trunk, where most of its energy was concentrated. The smith can barely lift the sword, let alone wield it, so he offers it free of charge if Kirito can. Not only can he unsheath it, he even takes a swing. Impressed, the smith honors his word. Despite the rules against practicing on a day of rest, Kirito decides to try out more advanced sword skills he hasn't been able to use thus far. During a 5-strike combo, he's thrown off balance and flings mud onto the uniform of the first sword seed. Levantaine looks the other way regarding practicing on a day of rest, but not for soiling his uniform. He challenges Kirito to a duel using real swords. Requiring consent from both parties, Levantaine proposes a first strike match, as opposed to stopping short, whereby the swordsman doesn't follow through. Despite his master's warnings, Kirito accepts the terms, as he's the one being punished. Lina informs him of the Levantaine family motto. They believe that drawing the blood of their enemy allows them to absorb their strength. This isn't his first battle fought with real swords. Kirito sees this in action when they begin their duel. It becomes clear that his power doesn't come from his stats alone. Levantaine draws on the power he believes courses through his family's veins, enveloping him in illusory flames, allowing him to use sword skills. He immediately lunges toward Kirito, who has a few tricks of his own, blocking the strike and locking blades. Kirito refuses to lose, like always, and uses the power of friendship and teenage angst to increase his own, using Levantaine's technique against him. His sword glows, infused with golden light. His resolve causes the blade to grow and turn blue with the power of the demon tree behind him. He attacks the first seed. Their duel is stopped short before either opponent causes serious damage. Kirito goes to check on the flowers he's been growing as a gift for his master, running into the 2 nobles who've hounded him and Yuio since they started at the academy. He finds his planter ravaged and begins to break down, until he hears the same mysterious voice from the cave. He learns that simply knowing system commands isn't the only way to change the world around him. Using his imagination and tapping into the life force of the flowers, he's able to resurrect them, discovering that the technique used in battle isn't reserved for destruction. Kirito's master realizes that believing her unique style was inferior was the reason she could never beat Levantaine. But after watching her page's duel, she's confident she can beat the first seed, regardless of technique. During the final examination, she finally wins against the first seed, snapping his practice sword in half. She graduates as the top swordsman in her year. Yuio and Kirito are promoted, now having their own pages to train. They're not the only ones. The nobles that have been bullying them have been promoted too. Kirito explains how to use one's imagination or will to effectively alter themselves or parts of the world. While attempting to unlock this ability, the two nobles, now first and second seat, focus their attention on Yuio after witnessing Kirito give his master the flowers they destroyed. Umber, the second seat, antagonizes Yuio. He loses to Yuio in a duel, despite Raios ending it short and calling it a draw. A few days later, Yuio wonders why they haven't retaliated. Kirito reasons they would be breaking the rules if they attacked fellow students, though he worries they may be looking for a loophole in the Taboo Index. The next day, they have a picnic with their pages, learning that there are ranks within the noble class as well. The lower-ranking ones are aristocrats in name only. Their pages relay the terrible treatment of their friend, a fellow page, following Yuio's duel with Umber. Kirito explains that even if something doesn't go against the Taboo Index, it doesn't make it right. There are things that no one should ever subject a fellow human to, regardless of loopholes in the law. Later, the two confront the nobles about the treatment of their pages, but get nowhere, as the nobles play dumb and claim that they aren't technically breaking the rules. Afterwards, Kirito expresses his suspicions that the matter isn't over. They must be planning something. Yuio's page, Tise, confesses that she is terrified at the possibility of marrying a noble who abuses their position of power. Soon after, Yuio and Kirito's pages are late for the first time. Fearing the worst, Kirito slips out the window to investigate when Umber's page, Franika, knocks on the door. Apparently, after refusing to go along with his abusive and perverse orders, the two pages went to confront the sadistic nobleman. Yuio races to their room to find both his and Kirito's pages tied up on the not-so-nobleman's bed. They claim that it's within their right to punish them however they deem fit. Yuio is stopped in his tracks after being given an order, unable to move. His right eye starts flickering red, sending a sharp pain throughout his whole body, just like the day he tried to stop the Integrity Knight from taking Alice. Yuio refuses to allow such scum to violate the innocent. His right eye bursts, breaking the seal, and he severs Umber's arm. Raios uses this as an excuse to kill Yuio now that he's broken the Taboo Index. Suddenly, Kirito bursts through the window, saving Yuio. Quickly ascertaining the situation, Kirito takes up arms against Raios. The two clash. Despite Raios' strength, he just can't keep his hands to himself, and without them, retaining blood becomes quite difficult. Raios writhes on the floor like a madman, his body glitching as if the system can't handle what's transpired. Even though they saved their pages, their crimes can't be unwritten. A mysterious face appears, citing the violation, as it did when Alice crossed into the dark territory. The next morning, an instructor heals Yuio's eye before escorting them to the Integrity Knight waiting to whisk them away to their execution. The boys are shocked as the knight introduces herself as none other than Alice. She strikes Yuio when he approaches, not recognizing her childhood friend. Their pages come to see them off, returning their swords and thanking them one last time as they're flown to the central cathedral chained to a dragon. At the facility, Asuna runs into a robot after visiting Kazuto. It turns out that they're trying to create a physical vessel to hold a fluctlight, making it easier for the AI to pilot and look more human. Back in the underworld, Yuio and Kirito discuss Alice's new condition and whether the voice in the cave was really Alice. They figure out that since they can still inspect the durability of items, and since their chains have the same object authority, theoretically, they should be able to break each other's. Hypothesis confirmed. It's time for a jailbreak. They find themselves outside on a garden terrace filled with roses. Now that they know Integrity Knights don't retain their memories, their goal changes. They have to rescue Alice and find a way to return her memories. Just when they think they're in the clear, they run into an Integrity Knight. Apparently, he's been waiting for them. It turns out he's Alice's disciple, Their chains won't help them now. The knight reveals his divine weapon, playing his hand too early. The two escapees devise a plan, but it's no use. Something's off. Yuio recognizes the knight's name. As soon as they remind him of his past, an object protrudes from his forehead, most likely whatever's messing with his memories. But before they can learn anything more, another Integrity Knight fires an arrow into Kirito's foot. The two prisoners decide to book it. Kirito hears a voice directing them to a door that appears out of nowhere. A giant library lies on the other side, the door disappearing behind them. A woman greets them, introducing herself as Cardinal. Getting Kirito alone, she explains that she knows about the outside world and the truth behind the Axiom Church. He comes to realize she's an incarnation of the Cardinal system that he's already familiar with. She explains that the Church's founder is a descendant of the one Wrath employee with more devious intentions than the other three. Queen Ella discovered the underlying system that formed the basis for the sacred arts. With this knowledge, she began to increase her system control authority until she had enough power and followers to start the Axiom Church. By creating the Taboo Index, she guaranteed no one could surpass her control authority. Nearing the end of her life, Queen Ella finally accessed the complete list of system commands, effectively making herself immortal. The Cardinal system was a threat to her power. Trying to gain the same authority level, she accidentally fused her Fluctlight with the system itself. After a time, Queen Ella realized that her Fluctlight memory capacity had reached its limit. She needed to devise a plan to overcome such limitations. She summoned a child, attempting to override her memories and supplant her own. Turns out it was her biggest mistake. She didn't account for potentially creating another godlike entity. The Cardinal system contains a sub-process that acts as error correction. When Queen Ella tried taking control of the girl's Fluctlight, the sub-process became contained within the woman calling herself Cardinal. After escaping to the Great Library, Queen Ella began to use the synthesis ritual to create Integrity Knights, while Cardinal sent out spies to gain allies of her own for the past 200 years. Despite this tyrannical rule over the underworld, Wrath never stepped in. Instead, they're using it as a test. The Dark Territories are set to invade the human realm, harboring Fluctlights of their own. Cardinal deemed it necessary to eliminate Queen Ella, the administrator, along with the Dark Territories, and the human ones. Despite that, she promises to save about 10 Fluctlights. Kirito agrees to help her, but he refuses to delete the entire world. He'll find a way to save as many people as possible. Cardinal explains that the prism protruding from the Integrity Knight is the key to saving Alice. They just need to secure the memories the administrator has locked away. Before they set off, she gives them 2 daggers, allowing her to cast any sacred art on whoever's flesh they pierce. They already have weapons that rival the Integrity Knights, though they still need the ability to perform perfect weapon arts by unlocking the memories and power infused into the weapon itself. With that, they set off to reach the top of the cathedral to take down the administrator and rescue Alice from her clutches. Kirito and Yuio make their way into the cathedral. Locating their swords is the first thing on their minds. They stumble across an armory filled to the brim. The church has been hoarding weapons and armor as if preparing for war. Luckily, that includes the boys' swords. Kirito, however, believes it's just another form of oppression out of fear of revolt. Upon finding the staircase leading to the top, they are met by an Integrity Knight's torrent of arrows. The duo barely evades the attack and plans their next move. Seeing how his bowstring has broken and his arrows are spent, it should be a piece of cake. That is, until he fires up his bow using its perfect weapon art. The knight accuses the two of corrupting Sir Eldrie's mind with dark arts. Protesting, they explain how they were trying to remind him of his life before becoming an Integrity Knight. But the bowman dismisses the idea. They have no past lives. They descend from the heavens themselves. Kirito tells Yuio to close in after he blocks the first shot. Despite his best efforts, the arrow smashes through his sacred arts, sending him flying when he tries to use his sword as a last-ditch effort. Now's his chance. Yuio rushes up the stairs and leaps at the Integrity Knight. Thinking about Alice allows him to unlock the Blue Rose Sword's power. A clash of ice and fire leaves the knight frozen in defeat. The knight marvels at their sword skills, surprised to learn of their unique Aincrad abilities, and is ultimately pleased to know that there are new styles to discover. The knight retracts his accusations and, out of respect, asks for their names. He warns the duo of a deadly ambush on the cathedral's 50th floor before requesting an honorable death by their sword and introducing himself as Deus Albert. Yuio recognizes him as the same Integrity Knight from the day of Alice's arrest, a day only he remembers. The administrator routinely wipes the knight's memories. Sparing him, the duo continues up the stairs until the sound of laughter stops them. Two young girls block their path. Introducing themselves as Fiesel and Lenal, they descend the stairs towards them. Kirito backs off to let Yuio take the lead, only leading him right into their trap and dagger. Before Kirito can act, Lenal flanks and shanks. Both boys end up paralyzed by the poison blades. Dragging their limp bodies up the stairs, the girls recount their brutal childhood. It turns out they're apprentice Integrity Knights who were forced to kill each other countless times as subjects in resurrection experiments. Kirito had recognized the girls' dagger scabbards as specific to sheathing poison blades and took precautions against the toxins. The effects were wearing off. When they reach the 50th floor and his captors are distracted by the ambush of knights awaiting them, Kirito launches his belated counterattack, disarming them and using their own poison against them. Telling Yuio to use his sacred arts as soon as his voice returns, Kirito engages the Integrity Knight, Fanatio. Unable to close the distance, Kirito's stomach and foot are pierced by the knight's perfect weapon art. Apparently, the blade was formed using 1,000 mirrors, allowing it to reflect the sun's energy. After receiving this very crucial information, Kirito uses sacred arts to conjure a mirror, rendering the attack useless. Destroying Fanatio's helmet reveals her attempt to conceal her gender to curb the bias of her opponents, despite the fact that women are the most powerful beings in Underworld. She releases her weapon art, but also hurts herself in the process. Kirito quickly tackles her in a bid to save her from herself, while Yuio uses his perfect weapon art to freeze Fanatio in place. But it isn't enough to stop her completely. To combat her desperate attempt to stop the duo, Kirito uses his perfect weapon art, rendering them both unconscious after a giant stream of black tendrils reminiscent of the Gigaseeder from which it was forged shoots out of the end of his blade. Yuio tries to transfer his life energy into Kirito, but Kirito stops him short, telling Yuio that Fanatio needs their help more than he does. They're all humans after all, even the two kids who were planning to execute them. Kirito tries to use healing arts on Fanatio. It's not enough. He calls out to her allies, to no avail. In a desperate bid to save her life, Kirito uses one of the blades meant for the administrator. The Cardinal chastises them, but gives them potions to heal themselves. If they can make it before she awakens, then they may still be able to defeat the administrator without using the Cardinal's blade. The two boys open the massive double doors to continue their ascent, only to find a massive elevator. They're surprised when they find a woman there who asks which floor, especially after revealing that they're fugitives. But she doesn't seem to care. This is her only job. She's just simply called the operator, and having spent the last 107 years doing this job, she knows of nothing outside of the shaft. They reach the 80th floor, only to discover an exquisite garden that neither of them expected to find. Yuio notices Alice and is having a difficult time holding back. Kirito tells him that he'll take care of the fighting while Yuio waits in the wings with the Cardinal's second blade. But when he charges towards her, she reveals that she's already using her perfect weapon art, the Osmanthus blade. The two clash, and Alice is surprised that Kirito is the second person able to withstand her attacks for more than a few seconds. While she's distracted, Yuio freezes her, but it's not enough to give them an opening. As soon as she uses her blade to thaw herself, Kirito uses his perfect weapon art, only to cause an explosion, leaving Yuio alone while the cathedral's walls immediately repair themselves with Alice and Kirito trapped outside. Kirito ends up saving them both by lodging his sword in the side of the giant building. Alice demands he let go of her and allow her to fall to her death, provoking him to chew her out for being so stubborn. He tries to explain how the Axiom Church and the Taboo Index are flawed and the Pontifex is a liar. Kirito's sword comes loose, only for Alice to surprise him by saving his life. They decide to make a truce and climb the tower until they reach an opening. Connected by a chain, they use metal spikes to slowly scale the cathedral. Back at the research facility, Asuna and Dr. Kojiro notice a ship on the horizon, but instead of staying around to protect them, it changes routes, provoking Mr. Nakanishi to make some frantic inquiries. As the sun sets in the underworld, Kirito is having trouble creating more spikes, and as they continue, they suddenly come face to face with gargoyle-esque statues that spring to life. Kirito has to think fast. He launches Alice up onto a ledge. She angrily returns the favor. She explains that they are familiars from the Dark Territories called minions, conjured from clumps of soil. She wants to know the reason for their presence just as much as he does. They make quick work of them. Seeing him fight reminds Alice of her past life, attending the Midsummer Festival, which confuses her. Had she been? Or had she just heard about it? She quickly changes the subject, offering a handkerchief to wipe off minion blood, making sure to ask for it back before they continue their duel. Meanwhile, inside, Yuio enters a giant bathhouse to find an Integrity Knight lounging, who asks him to wait until he gets dressed before they continue. The knight asks whether Fanatio is still alive, and then promises to spare Yuio since they spared her life. The two square up, and the knight warns him that he has no chance. He's going to use his best move first. Yuio doesn't stand a chance. The knight's using a blade made out of the system clock, the time-splitting sword, which allows him to strike the future? The Integrity Knight, however, doesn't see his next attack coming. Yuio throws the blue rose sword into the ceiling while attacking, throwing the knight off guard, and Yuio tackles him into the water. Using his weapon art to freeze the water with him in it, Yuio uses Release, which absorbs all the life force of those frozen in its weapon art, banking that his life force is higher than the knight's. Yuio becomes enraged after the knight recalls killing the dragon in the cave, barely remembering the blue rose sword. He's his hometown's founder and legendary warrior, Bercouli. The Integrity Knight admits to doubting the story of being summoned from heaven. But before any more revelations, the Prime Senator, Chudelkin, rolls in and completely freezes Bercouli and Yuio. Kirito's spidey senses tingle as he mutters Yuio's name, still outside on the ledge with Alice. They share a meal, and Kirito lets slip Alice's younger sister's name. Apprehensive, she allows him to continue, promising to end him if she detects him lying. Kirito explains the secret behind Integrity Knights and relays Alice's life before she became one. He goes on to say that the Integrity Knights aren't nearly enough to stop the Dark Territories' armies. They need to defeat the Administrator and train the people to take up arms against their enemies. Alice believes him and asks him to take her to the village before restoring her memories. She stands up and declares that she's renounced her role as an Integrity Knight, only to scream in pain. Her right eye turns red, but she refuses to give in. Kirito holds her as she denounces the Administrator and her tyranny, destroying her eye. Yuio wakes up, realizing he's been dreaming. He comes to in a strange place, unsure of how he got there. On a bed, there's a sleeping woman. The Cardinal tries to warn him, screaming for him to run, and the Administrator wakes up before he can use the dagger on her. She convinces him that no one truly loves him, not even Alice, and tricks him into reciting the sacred art that she uses on Integrity Knights. Alice wakes up to find Kirito out of breath and covered in sweat. Apparently, he carried her up to the 95th floor, finally inside the cathedral again. She recoils. How dare he foul her clothing with his sweaty body? To find Yuio, Kirito uses a sacred art to track the blue rose sword. Alice sees Bercouli, horrified to find him completely frozen, and recognizes the work of the Prime Senator. He thaws just enough to speak and commends her on being strong enough to break the seal in her eye. Kirito finds the blue rose sword under a layer of ice. Alice comments on wielding two swords, to which Kirito replies that fighting with 2 swords would be crazy. They continue to make their way to the top of the cathedral, only to find a room filled with people trapped in pods, or at least they used to be people. The Pontifex has them trapped, constantly working to monitor the citizens' behavior, finding those who break the Taboo Index and sending knights to apprehend them. In the next room, they hear Prime Senator Chudelkin freaking out. Alice confronts him about the truth of the Pontifex and Integrity Knights. The creepy little lout starts singing like a canary. It turns out she was forced into synthesis. Alice stabs him. He laughs. They've fallen into his trap. They run after him, entering a room with a small hole in the ceiling, but he's nowhere to be found. An Integrity Knight, Yuio, thanks them for returning his sword. He's unable or refuses to remember either Kirito or Alice, and the two square up. Kirito tries to remind Yuio of who he is while they clash, but despite remembering the names of his moves, he doesn't remember who taught him. Kirito pours his heart into his sword, and using the memories of friendship and angst-ridden screams, he notices the module placed in Yuio's forehead. For a second, it seems as though he remembers Alice, but uses his perfect weapon art to freeze them in place, much to the Prime Senator's dismay, who goes to finish them off. The administrator congratulates Yuio on his success and promises his reward after resynthesizing him. But as she does, he remembers Kirito from his childhood and refuses to chant the synthesis ritual. Taking out the Cardinal's dagger, he tries to stab the Pontifex, but no blade of metal is able to pierce her skin. She gives him one last chance to commit himself to her and destroy the dagger, but Yuio comes to his senses and realizes what true love and friendship are. She decides to force synthesis, but Yuio refuses to give up. Suddenly, the Prime Senator bursts through the floor, followed by Kirito and Alice. They all stop to have a convenient tearful reunion, while the less than scantily clad administrator looks on. Alice speaks out against her tyrannical reign. The administrator reveals that it was she who installed Code 871 to keep her subjects in line. With a newfound vigor, the Prime Senator conjures a giant flame monster he calls Genie, after the administrator promises him a night of rewards for his effort. Alice uses her weapon art to distract the flame genie, while Kirito powers up a shot directed at the senator himself, easily ripping through his unguarded, gross little form. Pretty anticlimactic. But this tips off the administrator to the fact that Kirito is really a human and not a real citizen of the underworld. The administrator activates her trump card, a giant golem made out of divine object-level swords, which she calls the Sword Golem. It instantly skewers Alice and throws Kirito against a wall, all but crushing him. Suddenly, Cardinal speaks through the spider she planted on Kirito's clothing. It grows into a giant and distracts the golem long enough for Yuio to use the dagger to stab the levitating disc, which conjures a door for the Cardinal to step through. She immediately heals Alice and Kirito. As if nothing happened, Kirito quickly explains who she is to Alice, as Cardinal laments the death of Charlotte, the spider with the very unique and original name. The administrator reveals that she's been stalling to trap Cardinal in the room with her. She also reveals that the golem's power source is converted humans by way of the piety module. She used the memories stolen from the Integrity Knights to distill their desire into each sword, which in turn makes them human, and the Cardinal is powerless to kill humans. She offers her own life in exchange for Alice's, Yuio's, and Kirito's safety. The administrator brutally tortures her, killing her slowly while cackling. They promise to avenge her, when suddenly Yuio discovers his purpose and asks Cardinal to transform him into a sword. Before his transformation is complete, he reveals that metal objects don't work on the Pontifex. Yuio, the sword, makes quick work of the golem, sets his sights on the administrator, and sacrifices himself to sever the Pontifex arm. The sword wasn't made of metal. Just as she turns her own severed arm into a sword to strike Kirito down, Alice jumps between them. Kirito has flashbacks to every other time this has happened, but instead of sitting there helpless, he finally takes up arms. Kirito dons his Black Swordsman attire and faces off against the Pontifex alone. He's surprised to find that she knows about his multi-strike combos. In fact, there's nothing about the system she doesn't know. Yuio takes Kirito's hand and pours his remaining energy into a blood-infused blue rose sword. Taking up both swords, he stands against the administrator, who only becomes more enraged with every strike. In an act of angsty friendship, Kirito sacrifices his arm, taking hers in the process, and uses the other to stab her with the blood blade, causing irreparable damage. Instead of attempting to finish him off, she slinks away, promising to meet again next time in his world. But the Prime Senator is somehow still alive, enough to beg her not to leave. He latches onto her, engulfing them in flames, killing them both. Yuio says a tearful goodbye while Kirito holds him in his arms. Yuio is reunited with his memory of Alice as a kid. Kirito approaches the system console and hears gunfire in the real world. The ocean turtle is under siege, and Kikuoka tells him to find Alice and take her to the World's End altar within the Dark Territories. Suddenly, his Fluctlight takes damage as the power is cut by the attackers. As he loses consciousness, Asuna descends from the ceiling, reaching out and calling to him. Months pass since Kirito's defeat of the Administrator. Due to a power surge combined with Yujio's death, the bond of friendship is broken, and so too is Kirito, now a husk of his former self. Alice takes him to their childhood village, though she's still branded a criminal, so the mayor, her father, turns them away. Now the two live in a cabin on the outskirts, only interacting with her sister and a group of woodcutters. One day, they ask Alice for help. She uses the power stored in the hard wood of Kirito's Gigacedar blade to cut down the inferior trees. All of a sudden, Kirito falls out of his wheelchair, grasping at the Northern Village young woodcutters who had taken Yujio's sword from him. The remnants of pure friendship cause the catatonic Kirito to move more than he has in weeks. Back at the cabin, a dragon descends from the sky, an Integrity Knight riding on its back. Eldrie Synthesis 31 is surprised to find Alice, even more so when he notices Kirito, whom he admonishes for killing the Pontifex and throwing the kingdom into turmoil. He begs Alice to return with him. The inhabitants of the Dark Territory have begun raiding towns and villages, but she feels responsible for Kirito's safety and refuses, prompting Eldrie to depart, dissatisfied. That night, Kirito reacts once again. This time, however, Alice notices plumes of smoke in the direction of Ruid. The raids are closer to home than she thought. Alice dons her armor underneath a cloak and makes haste, riding her dragon into the fray, shocking the villagers upon her arrival. She attempts to evacuate them, but her father and others refuse to take orders from a criminal. She has no choice but to reveal her identity as an Integrity Knight. Dumbfounded, the villagers immediately change their tune and book it, leaving Alice to fend off the horde of goblins and orcs. Later, she sets off to find the Integrity Knights that Eldrie mentioned. Meanwhile, on the Ocean Turtle, a small team of mercenaries infiltrate the base, only to find the control room empty. Asuna and the Wrath employees hide out in the sub-control room. It's clear the men know about Project Alice. They must gain access to Alice's Fluctlight before the mercs do. Apparently, when the power was cut, at the same time Kirito was accessing the virtual console, his self-destructive thoughts after Yujio's death were actualized. This somehow deactivated his Fluctlight's ego, apparently. It turns out that the mercenaries are GGO players that Kirito and co. fought before he was spirited away to the Underworld. The team's leader was hired off the books by the US government, who learned of Project Alice, and tasked him with recovering Alice's Fluctlight, presumably having a man on the inside. The mercenaries find themselves locked out of the sub-control room and the Fluctlights, so their tech genius figures the only way to extract the AI is by accessing a virtual console from inside the Underworld. Using his elite hacker skills, he discovers that each of the Dark Territory's denizens has a Fluctlight of their own, making them virtually identical to those in the human kingdom. He also notices the words "Final Load Test" popping up in the logs, unsure of what it is or whether it'll interfere with their plan. The plan is simple. Do a deep dive into the underworld using admin accounts and extract Alice from the inside. Luckily, all the high-level Dark Territory accounts don't require a password. Meanwhile, Wrath's tech genius has the same uninspired plan. Apparently, if they can mend the bonds of friendship, they can repair the damage to Kirito's Fluctlight from its sheer power. Asuna, being a conduit of interpersonal energy, volunteers to dive into the underworld to save Kirito and Alice. In Tokyo, Sinon is 1 kill away from winning the BOB in GGO, but the player Subtilizer catches up to her, rendering her sniper rifle useless in such close quarters. She's grabbed by the throat, and while the player strangles her, he ominously utters, "Your soul will be so sweet." She wakes with a start from the nightmare, still plagued by her PTSD. It turns out that Subtilizer is the leader of the mercenaries currently diving into the underworld. As a kid, Gabriel Miller just so happened to be unnervingly obsessed with souls, seeming not to have one of his own. He yearned to find out where in the body souls dwell. Gabriel dives as Emperor Vecta, with a member of his team as a Dark Knight. As the Emperor, he declares war on the human empire with overwhelming support. His only request is to capture the Priestess of Light, Alice, alive. However, in private, Shasta, General of the Dark Knights, disparages the Emperor to his subordinate and lover. They were planning to make peace with the human realm. That evening, the woman disguises herself as a concubine and heads to the Emperor's quarters. She produces a knife, though the would-be executioner quickly becomes the executed. With his hands around her neck, Gabriel remembers the first time he relieved someone of their life, pulling an ice pick out of his childhood friend's ear. His soulless eyes watch what he believes to be the girl's soul leaving her forehead and floating towards the sky. His obsession with Alicia bleeds into the underworld as the life leaves the assassin. He becomes giddy, convinced that the light leaving her body is her soul. Finally, after so many years and tests, he's recreated the same feeling. He inhales the strange substance, seeing a vision from the woman's memory as he did with Alicia. Since Alice's Fluctlight is so important, it must taste even sweeter. The next day, Emperor Vecta addresses his subjects, revealing the woman's frozen head in a block of ice as a warning to anyone who would challenge his rule. Shasta, her lover, becomes furious, going naked Super Saiyan? He attacks, only to have his entire being sucked into the empty black hole of the Emperor's soul. Terrified, the army rallies with cries of "Long live the Emperor!" In the human empire, Alice discovers that the Eastern Gate will be destroyed at the last stage as it begins to crumble. Eldrie greets Alice as she arrives at the Eastern Gate encampment, but goes off on her when he notices Kirito. Bercouli shows up, telling him to relax. Suddenly, he stops and attacks Alice. Somehow, the attack never lands. It turns out Kirito has unconscious latent friend no jutsu. That night, Alice becomes confused while dwelling on her feelings for Kirito. When she leans in to kiss the catatonic swordsman, she's interrupted by Kirito and Yujio's old Padawans, Ronie and Tise, who become upset at the revelation of Yujio's death and Kirito's condition. They promise to look after him during the battle. During the war meeting the following morning, the Integrity Knights plan to funnel the Dark Territories forces through the ravine where the Eastern Gate lies. It remains shrouded in darkness throughout the day, so they just have to absorb the energy from the deceased soldiers to render the enemy mages powerless. Usually, nobody would be able to accomplish such a task. The key is Alice, who somehow gained power akin to a god, for reasons. As the Eastern Gate falls with a flourish, both sides prepare for battle. Deus Elbert unleashes a torrent of his flaming arrows as the legions of goblins advance. Elsewhere, Eldrie is bypassed by goblins using smoke bombs, confusing the knight, as he's never seen anything like it. A soldier runs to warn the others of the incoming goblin forces, wondering where Integrity Knight Renly disappeared to. It turns out he turned tail and ran back to the supply corps. The hordes of giants are stopped in their tracks by Fanatio, who exudes a terrifying presence. That is, until their chief begins glitching out, his right eye glowing red as he breaks free from the pack, somehow rendering Fanatio frozen in place. He leaps into the air, but before his blow connects, one of Fanatio's knights blocks the attack, and her bones crack under the weight of the blow. The chief knocked away, Fanatio can move again, and swears vengeance. Wielding a beam extending to the heavens, she cuts the giant in half, ordering her troops to advance. Deus Albert runs out of arrows, provoking the goblin chief to attack. The knight cuts down many of the chief's subordinates, but is overrun and pinned by 2 of the goblins. As the chief goes to attack, one of Deus Albert's men distracts him, giving the Integrity Knight enough time to fire his sword like an arrow, which penetrates the goblin chief's defenses and wipes out his men. Alice hovers above the battlefield, observing the slaughter. She begins to absorb the spatial resources released upon death, creating a giant orb in the sky. The 2 kids who poisoned Kirito and Yuio in the cathedral, Linel and Fizel, fight their way back to the storage tents to find the catatonic swordsman and Renly the deserter. Before they make it back, Ronier and Tize stumble upon the green-haired knight. Suddenly, they see smoke outside of the tent. The mountain goblins have made their way through the ranks. Renly remembers his traumatic days in training, where he accidentally killed his best friend. Noticing Kirito trying to protect the girls, he grows some stones, saves them, and begins to unleash his double-winged blade's perfect weapon control. As he faces off against the mountain goblin's chief, his whole demeanor changes, and he makes quick work of him by slicing him in half vertically, which seems like the Integrity Knight's go-to method of dealing with pretty much everything. Linel and Fizel catch up to him, impressed that he actually did something. The Chancellor of the Dark Mages deploys the entirety of their minion forces, but she couldn't account for Bercouli's OP time-splitting sword, which wipes out every single one of them. Enraged, the Chancellor orders her mages to unleash their sacred arts, but they find themselves incapable of casting any magic. Alice has gathered all of the spatial resources in the area. She unleashes an incredibly strong energy beam and wipes out a large chunk of the enemy forces. Alice falls back, and Fanatio orders the mages to deplete the spatial energy by healing their troops. Eldrier appears, ashamed of his failure to stop the mountain goblins from bypassing his ranks. Suddenly, the ogre chief appears. He reveals the return of Emperor Vecta and his goal to capture someone called the Priestess of Light, who he presumes is Alice, before Alice proceeds to cut him down. She relays the new information to Bercouli. They plan to split their ranks and draw the enemy away from the ravine. In the Dark Territory, Vecta learns that spatial resources are released upon death and tells the Chancellor to kill 3,000 troops to garner enough resources to launch a counterattack. She then orders the Orc Chief to sacrifice a large portion of his men. As Alice and Bercouli approach by air, they're taken by surprise as the enemy casts a sacred art. The Chancellor laughs as she unleashes the enormous power scavenged from the sacrificed orcs. Suddenly, Eldrier flies to the front and draws away the enemy's sacred art attack and tries to counter it with his own, losing his life in the process. It succeeds in pissing Alice off, and she rage raises the mages to the earth, announcing herself as the Priestess of Light. Vecta watches as a grin spreads across his face, his strange soul fetish confounding Alice with Alicia. He orders the Dark Knights and Pugilists to follow the decoy south and capture the Priestess of Light unharmed. The Pugilists catch up first. They only use hand-to-hand combat and refuse to be cut by any sword. Sheta, an Integrity Knight known for her quiet demeanor, volunteers to take them on solo. When one of the pugilists goes to punch her, she uses her needle-like sword to slice through their fist and up their arm. The knight calmly begins cutting down their forces. Renly and his forces lie in wait, ready to ambush. Unbeknownst to them, Visago, the mercenary, is on a stealth mission at the supply corps camp, picking them off one by one. The leader of the pugilists faces off against Sheta. Both are equally matched in their fighting prowess and love battle. But one of the pugilists interrupts as the rest of their forces catch up, and the knight escapes with her dragon. At the supply corps camp, Vasago is met by Ronier and Tize, who try to defend the camp. Suddenly, a glowing figure appears in the sky. The girls recognize her as the goddess Stacia, who creates a giant rift between the armies and opens a pit below Vasago. As he falls, something clicks, and he recognizes Asuna. Before diving, Wrath's tech genius warned Asuna that despite her ability to modify the terrain, she should stop if she gets a headache, which she does to avoid overloading her Fluctlight. She admits that she's not Lady Stacia and tells the girls she's looking for Kirito. It just so happens she's run into the people who know exactly where he is. Her voice alone is enough to make the catatonic swordsman try reaching out, tears streaming down his cheeks. When leaving the caravan, she's suddenly attacked by a jealous Alice. Bercouli steps in and refutes her claim that Asuna is a spy or heretic, explaining that she saved them. They decide to hold a meeting with the other knights, where Asuna tries to explain that she's from another world looking for Alice. But Alice isn't too happy with the idea of going to the real world with her. Asuna learns about the inhibitor in the right eye and code 871. Bercouli connects the dots and figures that Vecta is from the real world. Asuna is shocked to learn that the Dark Territory has high-level accounts. Alice reluctantly agrees to go with her, but not before they defeat the enemy and save the human empire. The next day, the Dark Knights and Pugilists are ordered to cross the rift on ropes extending to the other side. On the Ocean Turtle, the mercenary tech genius syncs the Underworld's time 1-to-1 with the real world. He launches a patch and invites American VR MMO players to join a beta test in the Underworld to bolster the Dark Territory's defenses. Yui notices this and contacts Sinon and Lifa. They head to the Wrath facility in Tokyo, which contacts the Ocean Turtle and alerts them to the situation. Yui then informs Agil, Klein, and the others, who plan to transfer their player accounts from ALO to the Underworld. They're met with backlash when they try to rally other ALO players to join them. But after a passionate speech, everyone's convinced. In the Underworld, 20,000 American players descend from the sky in beams of red light as Level 1 Red Knights. Asuna attempts to erect rock walls to block them, but the Integrity Knights volunteer to hold them off. The Red Knights begin attacking everyone in sight, even the Dark Territory forces. The pugilist leader becomes infuriated when he notices Vecta dip out on his dragon. His right eye glows red and he brutally rips it out, only to rocket across the rift with flames shooting out of his feet. Asuna loses her cool and arm before the pugilist leader asks her to bridge the rift so his people can get across and help them fight the Red Knights. Alice tries to break free from the melee so she can attack from the top of a hill, until Vecta swoops in. His dragon snatches her and flies off. Since the Emperor has the Priestess of Light, the pugilist leader reckons they don't have to fight for him anymore and offers to hold off the American players. Sheta offers to join him, while the others follow Vecta. Back on the Ocean Turtle, the mercenary tech genius plans to deploy another 20,000 players to attack them. Vasago intends to join the fight, this time using his own special account. When the new players log on, Asuna and the others are surrounded. When it looks as though all hope is lost, a glowing figure appears in the sky, leveling the enemy forces with a powerful shot of her bow. Sinon apologizes for being late, and a teary-eyed Asuna embraces her. Sinon logs in as Solis, the sun goddess, and reunites with Asuna and Kirito, who remains in a catatonic state but appears to sense her friendship. Asuna requests that Sinon, who can fly, pursue Vecta while she prepares a counterattack against the remaining American players. Lifa also travels to the Underworld as Terraria, the Earth Goddess, and encounters Lil Pillin, the Orc Chieftain, who is shocked to be regarded as human for the first time. She allows him to take her to the Dark Lord Vecta as a prisoner, but they're confronted by the Dark Mage leader, DIL. She tries to consume Lifa's energy through the most obvious and convenient means, tentacles. But Lil Pillin overcomes Code 871 and comes to Lifa's rescue. Once free, Lifa severs the mage's arms, which has a significant impact on her overall health. Meanwhile, Bercouli Synthesis 1 rides on Dragonback in pursuit of Vecta and uses his sword's ability to ground Vecta's dragon. Despite his efforts, Bercouli is overwhelmed by Vecta's god mode and decides to fight to his death for Alice's sake. The Emperor leeches Bercouli's blade's incarnate abilities and clouds his consciousness, forcing him to lose focus on reality before severing his left arm. At the ruins, the remaining American players launch an attack on Asuna and her team, and Visago returns to the game in a new avatar, stalking Asuna from afar. Suddenly, Klein appears in the sky as a bright light in his ALO avatar, promptly followed by Agil, Liz, Silica, and hundreds of other players from ALO. They team up to launch a counterattack. At first, the group is overwhelmed, but with the reinforcements, they are able to gain the upper hand. Meanwhile, Higa, Wrath's tech genius, notices activity spikes in Kirito's Fluctlight as a result of his interactions with Asuna and Sinon. To restore Kirito's self-image, Higa devises a plan to use the Fluctlights of his friends. In order to execute the plan, they need to gain access to the main control room, which is currently occupied by the mercenaries. Higa decides to use a robot as a decoy, and through the ducts, gain access to a panel. Initially, he plans to go alone, but a maintenance worker, kind of a random NPC, volunteers to help. Despite being heavily injured, Bercouli attempts to use his time-splitting sword to slice Vecta in the past. However, Vecta catches him off guard. Just when it seems like it's Fluctlights out for Bercouli, his ever-loyal, if somewhat disobedient dragon appears and distracts Vecta, giving Bercouli enough time to strike the afterimage of Vecta in the past. The effects of the attack travel back to the future, extinguishing Vecta's Fluctlight capacitor. Bercouli succumbs to his wounds and dies as Alice wakes up, gutted upon seeing her dead uncle. Before his Force Ghost disappears, he asks Fanatio to take care of their unborn child. With Vecta dead, Miller asks Critter to convert a character from his personal account so that he can return to the Underworld and continue with his plans. Sinon discovers Alice mourning Bercouli's death. Her instinct is to go back and join the fight, but Sinon encourages her to keep moving towards the World's End altar. Alice is unsettled by Sinon's explanation that people from the real world can essentially come back in another body since they don't really die here. Elsewhere, Sheta and Iskan fight the enemy forces, and the cold psycho realizes she's been looking for the one person she doesn't want to slash. And it just so happens that person is a barely clothed kid who solves everything with his fist. Asuna and her companions are shocked to see Visago leading a massive army of Korean and Chinese players while watching over the battlefield with his Po character. Meanwhile, Miller wakes up and logs back into the game using his Subtleizer character, coming face to face with a horrified Sinon. Back in the real world, Higa is about to hack into the main control room to restore Kirito's Fluctlight, when the random maintenance worker NPC guy that volunteered to help pulls a gun on him. In the Underworld, Subtleizer overpowers Sinon with some crazy magic or something, but she is saved by the electrode that saved Kirito, which is a manifestation of pure friendship, unhindered by rules or logic. The ALO players try to convince the Red Knights that they were deceived, but Visago intervenes and rallies them once again with a paper-thin argument. Sheta and Iskan, along with the surviving pugilists, aren't looking too hot, but Lifa and Lil Pillin arrive with the orc forces, of course, just in time to save their skins. Back in the real world, NPC maintenance guy reveals himself as the traitor working with the Americans, admitting that he was also involved in the administrator's sabotage of the Alicization project. He wants Kirito to die in revenge for her death, and yammers on that he used to work with Sugo in his illegal experiments. Kikuoka and Rinku uncover the betrayal and realize that he's the one who inserted Code 871 into the Underworld. Asuna and the others surrender to protect the residents of the Underworld, and Visago confirms he really is Po. He confesses that he was the one who tipped off the assault team about Laughing Coffin's hideout in SAO, resulting in Asuna, Kirito, and the other frontline players becoming murderers. He then demands that Kirito be brought before him, and finally says it's showtime after decades of foreshadowing and buildup. In the midst of the chaos, Yui observes the SAO server rebooting unexpectedly. As Po is about to kill the catatonic Kirito, Eiji and Yuna arrive to aid him. Eiji challenges Po to avenge his friends from SAO, but he is ultimately defeated and Yuna takes him away. Po recalls his deep-seated resentment towards Japanese people, which stems from his father's abandonment and his mother, who was his father's mistress. His father only came to see him years later to ask him to donate a kidney to save his legitimate son's life, which prompted Po to steal nerve gear and log into SAO to kill Japanese players. Two of the red players recognize Po as a member of Laughing Coffin and try to persuade the others not to follow him, but their attempts are futile. Po uses his bizarre mind control power to make them start fighting each other. Elsewhere, Lifa's super account possesses unlimited regeneration, which enables her to keep fighting despite taking tons of damage and experiencing excruciating pain. She continues to fend off a swarm of red players until she's exhausted. She pulls through and makes her way to the World's End altar with the Orc forces. Meanwhile, Sinon somehow has Hecate, but her leg gets blown off by Subtilizer and she falls to the ground. Her imagination is able to make her rifle act like the super account's bow and shoot an annihilation ray. It's a hit, and Subtilizer runs away like a back at the ocean turtle. Evil trader maintenance guy's bullet merely grazes Higa. Another Wrath employee checks on him and throws something down the shaft, causing the gunman to lose his footing and plummet to the ground below. With the help of Asuna, Sinon, and Lifa, Higa tries to restore Kirito's Fluctlight, channeling their fremeries? Kirito awakens into what appears to be a dream. Visago threatens to keep killing residents of the underworld until Kirito awakens. Asuna hears words of encouragement from Yuki, gets up, and suddenly sprouts angel wings because, yeah. She then tosses him around like a rag doll. However, Visago's weapon siphons the spatial energy around him to heal himself and take control of the red players, ordering them to attack. Asuna reaches out to Kirito, who's replaying his guilt-ridden memories, losing his friends all over again, watching himself become a murderer. Breaking down, he starts trying to rip out his own heart. Asuna, Sinon, and Lifa's Fluctlights aren't enough to snap him out of it. That is, until a fragment of Yujio's own Fluctlight appears. Kirito, eyes wet with tears, asks his permission, if he's allowed to move on, to come back. His friends clasp his hand, creating a blinding light of friendship that restores his ego, self-image, Fluctlight thing, whatever. Kirito awakens in the underworld. The smell of roses fills the battlefield, and the lone Black Swordsman utters, "Enhance armament." Visago and the red players are stopped dead in their tracks by Yujio's blue rose sword. Kirito and Visago square up and start going at it, locking blades. It seems like Kirito is at a disadvantage, refusing to let go of the broken blue blade. Suddenly, Yujio's Force Ghost appears. He uses Release Recollection to force the Red Knights to log out. Visago attempts to use the spatial energy left behind, but Yuki's Force Ghost explains that because the now logged out players don't want that to happen, it won't. Then Kirito's old apprentice mentions that his sword was made out of a Gigaseeder, which apparently lets it absorb spatial energy. And it also does a thing, and bam, the blue rose sword is back. The two clash blades, but now Kirito is so full of friendship, it's impossible to beat him. He destroys Visago's blade and blasts a hole straight through his torso. Visago, laughing, says he'll just log back in. Kirito tells him that the only way he'll be logging out is at the hands of a lumberjack and releases the memory of his Gigaseeder blade, turning him into a tree. Meanwhile, Critter gets ready to remove the Underworld's limiters, so time will no longer be synced with the real world. Higa establishes a connection with Kirito's mind over an open channel, and Kikuoka warns him that if he doesn't escape with Asuna through the World's End altar, they'll be trapped there for 200 years. Alice arrives at the altar and sends her dragons away. But the dragons, equally as loyal as Bercouli's, confront Miller, who's still logged in and right on their tail. They don't really stand a chance, but before he can finish them off, Kirito and Asuna arrive on the scene. Asuna creates a staircase to the console and takes Alice to safety, while Kirito stays behind to face Miller. Kirito struggles against Miller's elite hacks. Somehow, he's become the most powerful entity in the underworld. Having completely mastered magic, a maniacal Miller rips Kirito's legs off, while the two zip around with wings, because they can fly now. Suddenly, Miller transforms into a giant monster thing, while Kirito debates whether he actually wants to stay in the underworld for selfish reasons. But his memory of Yuio disagrees. He's not selfish. The bad guy is, obviously. Releasing the power of both blades traps whatever Miller has become, turning the sky dark as night. All across the underworld, Kirito's friends give him their thoughts and prayers, which grants him unfathomable power. He goes in to finish Miller off, but he is broken free. The two battle, and Kirito gets his arm cut off. Yuio appears again, taking up his falling sword, and together, he and Kirito defeat Evil Incarnate. The server reaches maximum acceleration and forces everyone to log out. Kirito flies to the floating pastoral platform to make sure Asuna and Alice made it out in time. And it hits him. He'll be stuck there for the next 200 years, and he breaks down. Only to hear Asuna's voice. She had stayed behind. Rinko retrieves Alice's light cube, relieved to find that Alice's memories are intact, and thanks Kirito for protecting them. Asuna tells Rinko that she will stay behind in the underworld with Kirito as the system enters maximum acceleration. She promises to take care of him and keep him safe until he wakes up. Meanwhile, Miller returns to the real world, only to discover his own dead body. Alicia appears, his first victim, and tells him they get to spend eternity together as the floor turns liquid with hands reaching up to drag him below. Critter walks in to find Miller's corpse. He turns and sees Vasago's as well. Freaked out, he doesn't dwell on the logic or feasibility of the situation. He and the remaining mercenaries decide to dip. But before leaving, they rig the ocean turtle's main engine with explosives to destroy the facility and cover their tracks. However, Akihiko Kayaba, the creator of the original Sword Art Online, is somehow still around and able to control one of the installation's robots. He decides to disarm the bomb to save everyone, which is a first for Kayaba. On his initial attempt, the robot breaks down, but the mere mention of Kirito's ability to do the impossible gives Robot Kayaba a second wind, and he successfully disarms the bomb. Kirito and Asuna leave the World's End altar. All they have to do is live like 3 lifetimes before getting booted, which shouldn't have too much of an effect on them. Rinko holds a press conference to introduce Alice, now autonomous, with her Fluctlight implanted into an android. Alice puts a few reporters in their place, with some intro to philosophy rebuttals to all their ethical concerns, concerning life, the universe, and everything. Higa continues to watch over Kirito and Asuna, along with Kikuoka, who was officially declared dead as part of the cover-up for the incident. Alice notices that Kirito is waking up and unceremoniously checks out of the interview, leaving everyone hanging. Once Kirito comes to, he tells Alice that her sister is basically cryogenically frozen in the central cathedral, waiting for her. He then asks Higa to erase all of his and Asuna's memories of the past 200 years they spent together, ruling over the underworld as king and queen. While recuperating at the hospital, Kirito and Asuna are visited by Kikuoka, who tells them that he has a plan, or at least a hope, to prevent the government from seizing the underworld and its residents. Elsewhere, Higa talks to a copy of Kirito that he made before the memory deletion. Digital Kirito asks for his help in contacting Kayaba to look for a way to maintain the underworld in case the government interferes. At home, Kirito mourns Yujio's death. Sugu comes into his room and asks him to tell her his story. Kirito receives a call from Rinko. She tells him that Alice has made a break for it and is now MIA. He then receives a package and finds that Alice shipped herself to his house, inconspicuously using a box labeled Wrath. She loses it on Kirito for staying behind in the underworld. To help her adjust better, he shows her the family dojo, and they spar, only to break the training swords because of their immense power. At dinner, his family celebrates his release from the hospital while expressing concern about everything that happened and what it means for his real future in the world, with physical people. That night, Alice receives a cryptic email. She shows it to Kirito, and they figure out that it might connect to the underworld. Along with Asuna, they head over to what's left of Wrath to test their theory of entering the underworld via the IP address from the secret coded message. They log in and find themselves in outer space with a view of a planet that is probably the underworld. 2 spaceships suddenly appear and seem to be piloted by Ronie and Tisei's descendants, who are being chased by a giant space monster. Kirito steps in with Asuna and Alice to slay the interstellar behemoth with their swords, since they are gods now who can propel themselves through space wearing medieval armor. The Integrity pilots, named mostly due to lack of imagination, not tradition, immediately recognize them, and Yujio's Force Ghost, who's thrown into the mix. They obviously know them through some form of genetic memory. Teary-eyed, they're beside themselves at seeing the legendary heroes of the underworld as they fly back home. The public is weary in the aftermath of the Sword Art Online incident, which prompts the shift from VR to AR, augmented reality. One company dominates with the Ogma, the most popular peripheral used to play Ordinal Scale. It's like LARPing, but with a fancy headpiece, and an insanely realistic AI idol, Yuna, who everyone loves and knows her songs, yada yada, idols. Kirito gets sucked into playing by Asuna and company when Aincrad bosses begin appearing around Tokyo. One night, they join Klein in Akihabara to fight Kagachi, the samurai lord. Before the event starts, Yuna shows up to serenade the players, giving them all a buff. It's Kirito's first real activity after being stuck in bed for 2 years due to SAO, so he has some trouble keeping up physically, and can't RP to save his life. Asuna and Klein don't have that problem, being prolific OS players. Suddenly, a rocket veers off course, heading straight for Yuna, but a player watching from the shadows springs into action and saves her before helping out with the boss. Right before Asuna lands the final blow, she passes the mystery player, who whispers, "Switch." Everyone gets a big points boost for defeating the boss, and Asuna gets an additional reward for being the event's MVP. It turns out the mystery player, Eiji, is ranked 2nd overall. The number 1 spot is oddly empty. He also seems to know Asuna from SAO and calls her by her real name. The following night, Asuna joins Klein and his gang to battle another boss. Cut off from his friends, Eiji appears and starts sadistically toying with the isolated Klein. After the battle, Yuna tries to congratulate Asuna again, calling her by name this time, and Klein is nowhere to be found. On the MMO network, they find out that there's a book about SAO and what happened during the 2 years it was online. The book contains a detailed list of players who were trapped in SAO. The next day, Yui encourages an out-of-shape Kirito to practice sword skills in AR. When he activates Ordinal Scale, a girl hooded in white appears, seems to speak but not audibly, points in a direction, and then quickly disappears. Asuna shows up and confirms that Eiji was in her SAO guild, Knights of the Blood Oath, under the name Nautilus. The gang meets in Alfheim Online, and Yui grabs everyone's attention to announce her findings looking into Ordinal Scale and the reason behind the Aincrad boss cameos. By overlaying a map of SAO dungeons on top of that of Tokyo, she found they overlap with the recent appearances of the bosses. She uses this information to predict where the next boss events will be, and they're all concerned about Klein's absence. Elsewhere, Eiji talks with Yuna while crossing off names in his copy of the SAO book. That night, Kirito is paid a quick visit by the hooded virtual girl again, who's again super cryptic, and points again, and disappears again. Kirito then receives a call from Aegil, who breaks the news about Klein's hospitalization. Meanwhile, Asuna, Silica, and Liz attend another boss event. Eiji and Yuna are there again. He talks to Asuna and confirms his identity before he reverts back to cracked-out psychopath mode. Kirito shows up while the battle is underway, just in time to watch Silica get straight-up pranked when Pina, her pet from ALO, appears. But it's not Pina, and it quickly morphs into another powerful boss from the 91st floor. Eiji pushes Silica to the ground and stands there waiting to watch her get finished off. But Asuna jumps in and protects her, taking the attack herself. This triggers a flash of her memories from SAO, while a drone flies by and collects a glowing sphere from Asuna's Ogma. Completely oblivious to all of the weirdness of what just happened, Yuna bids farewell to Asuna and leaves. The hooded girl watches them from a distance. Kirito drops Asuna off at home. Beginning to forget her time in SAO, she asks him about how they first met. Later that night, she realizes how serious the gap in her memory is, contacts Kirito to meet up in ALO, and admits her memory loss. The next day, they go to the hospital, where they learn that many SAO survivors have been affected by memory loss, presumably due to some unknown function of the Ogma. Later, they tour Einkrad, as it's recreated in ALO, but nothing jogs her memory. She breaks down in their cabin and tells Kirito that she's afraid of losing him and their memories together. Elsewhere, Eiji strokes his own ego about how he's better at AR than the two best SAO players. Kirito visits Klein, who's still in the hospital with a mangled arm and suffering the same kind of amnesia as Asuna. He decides to take matters into his own hands and attend more events to figure out what's going on. He warns his friends not to play OS until he solves the mystery. Despite his warning, Sinon shows up at the next boss fight. She reminds him that she doesn't have any SAO memories to lose anyway. She's a GGO girl. During the boss battle, someone is taken out, and a drone swoops in and scoops up the glowing orange sphere that is their extracted memories. Yui sees it and jets off after it into the drone, but before she can discover anything, she's locked out by a firewall. After the battle, Kirito sees the mysterious girl hooded in white again. He is pissed. She doesn't respond to his questions. She just pops up out of nowhere, points, and disappears. Sinon notices his frustration and asks him what's going on. At last, Kirito puts it together that all the pointing was, in fact, communication, and asks Yui to sort out what she was pointing at from each location that she appeared. Bam! All the pointing intersects at the Toto Institute of Technology, where the Ogma's creator, Tetsuhiro Shigemura, is a professor. Kirito attends one of his lectures, and afterwards, in his office, accuses him of being behind the memory thefts. Shigemura feigns ignorance and tries to spin losing SAO memories as a good thing for the survivors. On his way out, Kirito notices a picture on his desk that looks exactly like Yuna, the AI idol. He realizes that she is Shigemura's daughter, who died in the SAO incident. Kirito visits Asuna at her place. Alone in her room, he finds her diary and, without hesitation, completely invades her privacy. He discovers that she doesn't remember his promise to take her camping. She catches him reading it, but doesn't mind, and even invites him to read it all. Elsewhere, Yuna is excited about her upcoming stadium concert. She asks Eiji to read more of the SAO book to her, specifically about him. But he's embarrassed to say he's not even mentioned in it at all. He admits that he was weak and cowardly in SAO, hence his current overcompensation in AR. Meanwhile, Kirito walks home and gets ambushed by the hooded ghost girl, who turns out to be another version of Yuna. She transports him to a virtual space that resembles Einkrad. He starts questioning her, but she just breaks into song. He wants to know what he needs to do to get Asuna's memories back. And the only somewhat useful thing that Ghost Yuna says is that he's not strong enough to do that yet. She then tells him to wake up and snaps her fingers, sending him back to reality. He comes to in a bush with a cop standing over him who doesn't even get his name or question him at all. Apparently, it's a normal enough thing for kids to be waking up in the bushes. Kirito continues his quest for answers and hits up every boss battle he can, fighting recklessly, risking his memories, but leveling up like the Dickens. Eiji finally shows up, and Kirito tries to fight him, but he can't match his speed and strength since Eiji is using elite hacks. The night of the concert, the gang finds their seats and wonders where Kirito is. He's in the parking garage, about to face off with Eiji again. He calls him by his SAO name, Nautilus, and he gets butthurt and whines that his name is Eiji now. Instead of dealing with the very real problem of people's memories being erased, they decide to settle things by LARPing in Ordinal Scale. Meanwhile, Shigemura watches the concert from his lab and talks to himself, or to Kaiba's Force Ghost? Or maybe it's his fantasy of Kaiba's Force Ghost ego-stroking his plan to revive Yuna using SAO survivors' memories. Eiji tells Kirito that he loved Yuna in SAO and that he wants to bring her back to life, and reveals that he's working with Shigemura to collect SAO memories for Yuna's revival project. Now that Kirito has some idea of what's going on, he disables Eiji's OP hack device, wrecks him, and goes to join his friends. Then, Shigemura tells Eiji that he'll be using his memories of Yuna as well, since he has the most data on her. A predictable betrayal. The same boss he sicked on Silica appears and attacks Eiji, who doesn't take off his Ogma because, well, the plot requires that he doesn't. Shigemura waits to steal the memories of everyone at the concert, causing panic as monsters fill the stadium after Yuna finishes a single song. Some of the audience think it's a special event, a part of the show, and start fighting. Hooded Ghost Yuna confronts her father and tries to stop him, but he says it's too late. He's come too close to stop now. Her father's a lost cause, so she zips down to Kirito and fills him in. He tries to get people to remove their Ogma devices, but that would be way too easy. Yuna tells him that they need to use the Ogma's hidden full dive capabilities to dive into Aincrad and defeat the 100th floor boss, because that will stop Shigemura's plan, somehow. He agrees and leaves Asuna to watch over their unconscious bodies. Kirito and the others full dive into Aincrad and face the boss, but they are overwhelmed by its power. Asuna, despite not remembering anything from SAO, seems to intuitively understand that nothing properly gets done without her involvement. She and Yui gather their friends from ALO to join the fight, and they transfer their old gear and skills from SAO, giving them an advantage. They manage to defeat the boss with pure, unadulterated friendship and clear SAO for real-ish, ignoring like 24 other bosses. Kirito receives the strongest sword in the game as a reward, and everyone else gets nothing but the friends they made along the way. They return to the stadium, having stopped Shigemura's plan. Kikuoka finds the professor in his lab and arrests him. The gang meets in Egil's bar, while Kirito and Asuna go on their camping trip. He finally proposes to her, in the real, and a meteor shower lights up the night sky. Thank you for sticking until the end. Subscribe for more videos like this.